While the world's gaze was fixed on the Middle East in June 2025, where the United States and Israel were intensifying a brutal military campaign against Iran, a far quieter yet equally consequential development was unfolding in Southeast Asia. Almost unnoticed by mainstream Western media, Vietnam, an increasingly important voice in the global South, officially joined BRICS as a partner country. Though announced with little fanfare, this strategic move marks a major shift in the global balance of power. It signals that Vietnam, a nation with a long legacy of anti-colonial resistance and a fiercely independent foreign policy, is choosing to integrate more deeply with a rising multipolar world, one where the rules are no longer written exclusively in Washington, Brussels, or London. Vietnam's entrance into BRICS is no symbolic gesture. With nearly 100 million people and one of the fastest-growing economies in Asia, Vietnam has transformed over the past 2 decades into a manufacturing and export powerhouse. It has become a key node in global supply chains for high-tech goods, electronics, textiles, and increasingly, green energy components. Its strategic location at the heart of Southeast Asia has made it vital not only economically, but geopolitically. It's no surprise, then, that BRICS, which originally included Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, sought to bring Vietnam into its expanding circle. The timing could not have been more telling. Vietnam had been invited to join BRICS as a partner country during the October 2024 summit in Kazan, Russia. But while other partner nations quickly confirmed their status in early 2025, Vietnam waited. And it waited. Months passed without a word, raising speculation about whether it would accept. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, BRICS made the official announcement in June, just as US and Israeli forces launched another round of strikes on Iran. While the world focused on bombs falling in Tehran, Vietnam quietly entered a new geopolitical arena, one that the United States has been aggressively trying to sideline and delegitimize. This wasn't just a diplomatic coincidence, it was a strategic calculation. Vietnam understood the weight of its decision and the potential backlash it might receive. It knew that aligning more closely with China's orbit through BRICS could provoke anxiety in Washington. But by making the announcement while the US was preoccupied with a high-risk war in the Middle East, Vietnam cleverly minimized immediate political fallout and allowed the move to slide under the radar, at least temporarily. This step is significant in the broader context of BRICS's ongoing evolution. From its inception in 2009, the bloc has been a platform for emerging economies to assert more control over global economic governance. In 2010, South Africa joined the original 4 members, expanding the group into a more geographically diverse coalition. In 2024, 5 new full members, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the UAE, joined, underscoring BRICS's transformation into a truly global alliance. Then in 2025, 10 more nations were added as partner states: Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and crucially, Vietnam. These additions represent more than mere diplomatic expansion. Together, the 20 nations that now make up BRICS Plus account for 44% of global GDP, when measured by purchasing power parity, and over 56% of the world's population, 4.45 billion people. That's more than half the human race, living in countries that have collectively decided to pursue a new path, one not dictated by the IMF, NATO, or the Washington Consensus. Yet, despite this massive demographic and economic weight, Western media and policymakers continue to downplay BRICS's relevance, often dismissing it as a loose collection of nations with no real cohesion or global vision. But this is a fundamental misreading of what BRICS represents, especially in the current climate where Washington has openly admitted to engaging in a second Cold War, this time aimed at containing China. BRICS offers an alternative vision of global cooperation. It is not an anti-Western bloc, but rather a vehicle for the global South to reclaim agency, foster mutual development, and resist the pressure to align with great power agendas. And it's in this context that Vietnam's decision becomes even more remarkable. Because for years now, the United States has made a concerted effort to woo Vietnam into its camp. American officials have openly described Vietnam as a potential ally in their broader Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China's rise. They have promised trade deals, increased investment, and strategic cooperation. Corporations like Apple, Google, and Samsung have moved significant portions of their manufacturing operations to Vietnam, a process U.S. policymakers call friendshoring. The aim is clear: push China out of global supply chains and replace it with more friendly nations like Vietnam. But what Washington overlooks, or perhaps refuses to understand, is Vietnam's deeply rooted commitment to independence and non-alignment. This is a country that spent centuries resisting foreign domination, from Chinese dynasties to French colonizers to American imperialists. Its national memory is steeped in resistance, sovereignty, and survival. Despite enjoying a rapidly growing trade relationship with the U.S., Vietnam has never indicated that it is willing to join any formal alliance aimed at confronting or encircling China. In fact, the more Washington has tried to pressure Vietnam, the more resilient Hanoi's position has become. When Donald Trump, having returned to the presidency, imposed sweeping new tariffs on dozens of countries in April 2025, tariffs that included a punishing 46% tax on Vietnamese exports, he did more to damage U.S.-Vietnam relations in a single stroke than years of diplomacy could repair. Rather than push Vietnam into Washington's camp, the tariffs sent a loud message that the U.S. could not be trusted as a reliable economic partner. And in Beijing, that message did not go unnoticed. Within days of Trump's tariff announcement, Chinese President Xi Jinping made a surprise visit to Vietnam. In a powerful show of diplomatic agility, the two governments signed 45 bilateral agreements, ranging from infrastructure development and digital trade to high-speed rail and green energy cooperation. As the U.S. was demanding Vietnam cut China out of its supply chains, Vietnam and China were drawing theirs even closer together. The historical backdrop only adds layers of complexity and meaning to this growing cooperation. Vietnam and China have a complicated, sometimes painful shared history. For over a millennium, Chinese empires sought to subjugate Vietnam. Resistance leaders like the Trung sisters and Lê Loi are still celebrated today for fighting off imperial invasions. Even in the modern era, tensions remained. After China's Communist Revolution in 1949, relations improved for a time. China supported Vietnam's resistance to both French colonialism and later American intervention during the Vietnam War. Yet after the U.S. withdrawal in 1979, China and Vietnam fought a short but bloody war, the last war China has fought to date. Despite these ups and downs, the post-Cold War era has seen a steady thawing. Following the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, Vietnam began rebalancing its relationships, turning more toward ASEAN, China, and eventually even the U.S. But it never abandoned its fundamental commitment to independence. That principle is enshrined in what the Vietnamese government calls its Four No's policy. No participation in military alliances, no siding with one country against another, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese soil, and no use or threat of force in international relations. In this framework, Vietnam's decision to join BRICS is not about choosing sides, it's about reinforcing its autonomy. By joining a bloc that includes both China and India, both Iran and Brazil, both Ethiopia and Russia, Vietnam is choosing to engage with the world on its own terms, not those dictated by any single power. It's a reaffirmation that Vietnam, despite its past traumas and present economic pressures, will not be cornered into taking part in a new Cold War. It refuses to be used as a pawn in America's encirclement strategy. And by joining BRICS, it aligns itself with a broader coalition of nations who share that vision of multipolar cooperation, peaceful development, and sovereign decision-making. So, while the bombs fall over the Middle East and the rhetoric of great power conflict escalates in Washington and Beijing, Vietnam has quietly redrawn its place on the global map, not by joining a military alliance, but by aligning with a coalition rooted in economic cooperation, political independence, and a shared future that no longer bends to the will of empires. China and Vietnam have a lot in common, not just in culture and history, but also in how they run their governments and economies. Both countries follow a socialist system led by a communist party. China is led by the Communist Party of China, and Vietnam is governed by the Communist Party of Vietnam. Neither country is part of any military alliance, and both have made it clear they want to stay neutral in global conflicts. Even though China and Russia are very close partners, they don't have a formal alliance. Their relationship is simply called a comprehensive strategic partnership, which means they cooperate closely but don't have military obligations to each other. Vietnam and China also have very similar economic systems. Vietnam calls its system a socialist-oriented market economy, and China calls its system a socialist market economy. Both countries combine strong government control in key sectors with elements of capitalism. After the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, Vietnam began major economic reforms that were very similar to the ones China had started earlier, under leader Deng Xiaoping in 1978. These changes helped open their economies to global trade while keeping control over important industries like banking, energy, and telecommunications. The results have been impressive. China has lifted about 800 million people out of extreme poverty in just a few decades. That's almost 3/4 of the world's total reduction in poverty. Vietnam, although smaller, has also done extremely well. It's become a major center for manufacturing, especially in electronics. Many US companies that used to make products in China are now moving their factories to Vietnam. Today, Vietnam produces a growing number of phones, computers, and batteries for the global market. Economically, Vietnam has risen fast. In 2025, China's GDP per person, measured using purchasing power, is around $29,000, and Vietnam's is about $17,500. That's much higher than countries like the Philippines or India. Although the media often praises India's economy, partly because the US wants to build closer ties with India, Vietnam's development has actually been faster and more effective. Back in 1990, China and Vietnam were poorer than Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the world. But today, both have rapidly growing, modern economies, while Haiti still struggles with poverty and instability. Of course, GDP doesn't tell the full story. A better way to understand how people are doing is to look at average daily income. In China, the average income rose from just $2 per day in 1990 to $15 per day by 2022. In Vietnam, it grew from about $3 to $14 per day. Meanwhile, India only went from $3 to about $5 in the same time. Bangladesh and the Philippines also saw smaller increases. This shows how China and Vietnam's model, mixing government planning with market activity, has worked better for improving people's daily lives. Their approach gives the state control over the most important parts of the economy, while still allowing private companies to operate. This balance has helped them grow faster and more fairly than countries that rely only on capitalism. It also shows in other areas like health. In 1949, before China's revolution, life expectancy was only around 32 or 33 years. By 2023, it had jumped to 78 years, about the same as in the United States. In Vietnam, life expectancy in 1974 was just 55 years due to the long war with the US, but by 2023, it had reached 75 years. In contrast, India's life expectancy in 2023 was 72 years, still lower than both China and Vietnam. Given this progress, it's not surprising that the governments of China and Vietnam are very popular. Surveys by a Western group called the Alliance of Democracies show that over 80% of people in China and nearly 80% in Vietnam believe their governments are democratic. These are not government-run surveys. They come from an independent group based in the West. To people in China and Vietnam, democracy means a government that works for the people and improves their lives, not just having elections. They see their governments as responsive, stable, and focused on public good. Compare this with countries like the US, where billionaires have a lot of political power. In the Trump administration, for example, many cabinet members were billionaires themselves. Trump is a billionaire too. In countries like the US, many people feel the system favors the rich and powerful, not the ordinary citizen. That's why more and more people are calling Western countries oligarchies, governments run by elites, rather than true democracies. According to the Democracy Perception Index of 2025, the most popular governments in the world are in China and Vietnam. Other popular governments include those in Algeria and Nicaragua, countries that also had revolutions and now follow more left-wing policies. Meanwhile, many Western governments are losing support at home, as people feel their needs are not being met. All of this shows that the usual stories we hear in the West about democracy and authoritarianism are often one-sided or misleading. Countries like China and Vietnam are offering a different path, one that focuses on national development, independence, and reducing poverty without relying on war or foreign control. Instead of copying the Western model, they are creating their own way forward. This change is part of a bigger shift happening in the world. Groups like BRICS are bringing countries in the global south together to cooperate on equal terms. Another example is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which includes Vietnam. ASEAN promotes peace and diplomacy, not conflict. It's a group that focuses on solving problems through discussion rather than war, which is very different from how some Western countries act on the world stage. In May 2025, a historic meeting took place between ASEAN, the Gulf countries, the GCC, and China. This kind of cooperation is becoming more common. It shows that countries in the global south are building stronger ties, creating their own networks, and shaping a more peaceful and fair world, one that isn't controlled by Western powers. As China and Vietnam continue to grow and succeed, they're showing that there is more than one way to build a prosperous, independent, and stable society. And more countries are starting to take notice.